The forward operating base sat in silence under a sky the color of gunmetal dust devils spinning across the tarmac like ghosts searching for something to haunt. Captain Mara Blackwood stood outside the operations center, watching the horizon where the Hindu Kush Mountains carved jagged teeth into the afternoon light. Her hands were steady around a cup of coffee gone cold 3 hours ago. Inside, voices rose and fell in waves of controlled panic. The kind of panic that comes when good men are dying and nobody knows how to stop it. 12 miles north, a Marine reconnaissance team was pinned in a valley so narrow the shadows never left. Taliban fighters had come down from the ridgelines like water finding its level, and now 23 Americans were trapped in a kill box with ammunition running low and air support grounded by weather that had rolled in fast and mean. The clouds sat at 8,000 feet, thick as concrete, and every fast mover they'd scrambled had turned back rather than risk controlled flight into terrain. The operations officer had stopped taking calls from the ground force commander. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. Mara set down her coffee on a stack of sandbags and walked toward the flight line. Her A-10 Thunderbolt sat squat and ugly on the hardstand, nose art faded from too many missions and not enough maintenance hours. Someone had spray-painted Widowmaker on the fuselage in letters that looked like they'd been written by a child, not her call sign. That had been her husband's plane before Helmand Province, before the MANPADS that rose from a compound wall and erased him from the sky in 3 seconds of white fire. She'd requested the aircraft specifically. Command had approved it because they thought she was sentimental. They were wrong. She was methodical. Her crew chief looked up from a hydraulic panel, wrench in hand, question in his eyes. Staff Sergeant Domingo Reyes had been working A-10 since before the invasion, back when people still thought close air support meant showing up close to on time. He knew her walk, knew that particular set to her shoulders that meant she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Ma'am Towers got everything grounded. Mara pulled her helmet bag from the crew compartment and started her pre-flight by touch, fingers reading the aircraft like Braille. Towers about to make an exception. That ceiling's below minimums for instrument approach. You'd be flying blind through mountains. She looked at him then and he saw something in her face that made him take a step back. Not anger, something colder. Something that looked like math being done in real time with human lives as variables. Sergeant, how many kids you got? 3, ma'ams. Why? Because 23 Marines up in that valley have kids too, or will, if someone goes. The operations center smelled like sweat and stale coffee and the particular flavor of dread that accumulates when radio silence stretches too long. Major Kyle Vance stood over a map table covered in acetate and grease pencil marks, calculating angles that didn't work and altitudes that couldn't be reached. He'd been flying strike missions since the towers fell, had put warheads on foreheads from Kandahar to Mosul, and he knew when a situation had crossed from difficult to impossible. This one had made that crossing an hour ago. The door banged open and Mara walked in still wearing her flight suit, helmet bag over one shoulder. Vance didn't look up. We're grounded, Captain, weather's not moving. Sir, I can get under it. Now he looked up, looked at her like she'd just suggested they resolve the situation with a strongly worded letter. Under 8,000 feet of cloud and mountain terrain, that's not flying, that's controlled crashing with extra steps. I've flown lowers. Not in these mountains you haven't. She moved to the map, traced a line with one finger up a valley that looked like a crooked knife wound in the topography. Warthog can fly slow, can fly low, can fly in weather that would put an F-16 into a ridgeline. That's what we're built for. Vance shook his head. The movement looked tired. You're talking about contour flying in instrument conditions through terrain we barely have charts for. If you clip a ridgeline by 50 feet, you're not walking away. Those Marines aren't walking away either, not without us. The radio crackled with another call from the ground force commander. His voice had gone quiet the way voices do when men stop asking for help and start saying goodbye. Vance stared at the speaker like it was a jury reading a verdict. When he looked back at Mara, something had shifted in his face. You're a single dad, aren't you, Captain? She blinked, sir. Your personnel file, sole custodian of a minor child after your husband's death. That makes you a single parent, which makes you ineligible for volunteer high-risk missions under current regulations. Around the room, conversations stopped. People found reasons to look at maps, at screens, at anything except the captain standing at attention with her jaw set like stone. My daughter's 12 years old, Mara said quietly. Old enough to understand that some things matter more than fear, old enough to know her mother doesn't leave people behind. Old enough to be an orphan twice over if you auger in. Old enough to live with a coward if I don't go. The silence that followed had weight to it, had texture. Vance looked at her for a long moment, then at the map, then at the radio still hissing with distance and desperation. He pulled a flight authorization form from a clipboard and signed it without meeting her eyes. Your funeral, Captain's literally. She took the form and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. Blackwood, what's your call sign? They call me Revenant, sir. Why? Because I come back. Pre-flight took 11 minutes, every second measured against the ammunition counter ticking down in that valley 12 miles north. Mara's hands moved through the checklist with the efficiency of muscle memory, checking control surfaces and weapons pylons while Sergeant Reyes uploaded coordinates into the targeting pod. The A-10 carried 11 Maverick missiles, a full load of 30mm ammunition, and enough fuel for 90 minutes of loiter time. Enough to make a difference. Enough to die trying. Reyes climbed down from the cockpit and stood on the tarmac looking up at her. Ma'am, my wife's gonna kill me for not stopping you. Tell her I outrank you. She outranks both of us. He wasn't smiling. You really think you can thread that needle? Mara pulled on her helmet, felt the familiar weight settle around her skull like a crown made of Kevlar and electronics. I think those Marines are somebody's sons, somebody's husbands, and I think I'm sitting in a plane that was built specifically to save them. Your husband flew this bird. I know. He didn't come back. I know that too. She started the auxiliary power unit, felt the whine build through the airframe. But I'm not him, I'm better. The twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with a sound like the world's angriest vacuum cleaner, and Mara ran through her final checks while the tower frequency crackled with confusion. They hadn't expected anyone to be crazy enough to launch. She keyed the radio. Tower, Revenant 1 requesting taxi for immediate departure. Long pause, then Revenant 1, say again your intentions. Tower, my intentions are to save some lives. I'd appreciate you clearing me out of your airspace so I can get started. Another pause, longer, someone making a decision that might cost them their career. Revenant 1, winds are 270 at 15 gusting 23, ceiling measured at 8,000 feet. You are cleared to taxi. God go with you. Appreciate the sentiment, Tower, but I'll settle for clear skies on the other side. She taxied out with the nose pointed at mountains she couldn't see, hidden behind weather that looked like the end of the world had been painted in shades of gray and darker gray. The runway stretched ahead like a promise nobody expected her to keep. She pushed the throttles forward and felt the Thunderbolt accelerate with the grace of a flying dumpster that had somehow learned to defy gravity through sheer stubbornness and 30,000 pounds of thrust. At rotation speed, she pulled back and the Earth fell away. The clouds swallowed her at 400 feet, turning the world into nothing but gray static and the green glow of instruments. Mara flew by the gauges, trusting numbers more than instinct, watching the radar altimeter count terrain clearance in hundreds of feet that felt like inches. The A-10 bucked through turbulence that wanted to flip her inverted, and she fought the stick with pressure born from thousands of hours of turning chaos into something like controlled flight. The radio was a lifeline threaded through static. Dagger 6, this is Revenant 1, I'm inbound your position. ETA 8 minutes. Need immediate marking of friendly positions and targets of opportunity. The ground force commander's voice came back rough with disbelief and something that might have been hope. Revenant 1, Dagger 6, we're in a valley running north-south, pinned from 3 sides. Enemy concentrations on ridgelines east and west. Be advised you're not going to have visual on anything until you're danger close. Dagger 6, danger close is where I live. Just keep your heads down and trust me. She dropped lower, chasing the terrain with a radar altimeter that was screaming warnings she'd learned to ignore. At 200 feet above ground level, she broke through the cloud deck into a world of rain and failing light, and ahead the valley opened up like a throat trying to swallow her whole. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks still hidden in cloud, their slopes covered in rocks and scree that would shred an aircraft into confetti if she misjudged her clearance by a wingspan. The targeting pod found them first, thermal signatures blooming white-hot against the cold earth. Mara counted bodies, counted muzzle flashes, counted the angles that would let her put 30mm hate into enemy positions without turning her own side into casualties. The math was brutal. The math was always brutal. Dagger 6, Revenant 1 has visual. I'm coming in low from the south. When you see me, mark your position with smoke. Revenant 1, we're out of smoke. Then wave something, I need to know where not to shoot. She banked hard, feeling the G-forces press her into the seat, and lined up on a ridgeline where thermal imaging showed Taliban fighters dug in behind rocks. The 30mm Gatling gun was mounted in the nose, and when she squeezed the trigger, the whole aircraft shuddered like it was coughing up pieces of its own soul. Depleted uranium rounds walked up the slope at 70 rounds per second, each one capable of punching through tank armor, and the ridgeline came apart in flowers of pulverized stone and bodies that stopped being people and became physics problems solved with extreme prejudice. She pulled up hard, climbing back into the clouds to reposition, and the radio exploded with voices. Revenant 1, Dagger 6, good hits, good hits. We've got enemy breaking contact on the east side. Dagger 6, stay down, I'm not done yet. Back at the operations center, Major Vance stood frozen in front of the radio speaker, listening to the sound of an A-10's gun runs echoing through static like thunder being born in real time. Around him, the room had gone silent except for the crackling radio and someone's quiet prayer whispered into the chemical smell of the air conditioning. On the map, a grease pencil dot represented Revenant 1, but maps were lies told to people who needed comfort. That dot was a woman flying an airplane through mountains in weather that should have killed her already, and every second she stayed airborne was borrowed time with interest compounding. The tactical frequency lit up again. All stations, Dagger 6, we have enemy reinforcements moving up the valley from the north. Revenant 1, they're bringing up technicals with heavy weapons. Mara toggled her radio through the turbulence. Dagger 6, I see them. Two Toyota Hiluxes with what looks like DSHK heavy machine guns. They're about to have a very bad day. She rolled inverted and pulled through, dropping out of the cloud base upside down at 150 knots, the world spinning around her in shades of gray and green, and the brown earth rushing up like it wanted to embrace her. At the last possible second, she rolled wings level and pickled off two Maverick missiles that came off the rails with solid fuel kicks that felt like God punching the airframe. The missiles tracked on infrared, chasing the heat signatures of engines and bodies and dreams of martyrdom that ended in white phosphorus and overpressure that turned metal into shrapnel and shrapnel into memory. The trucks disappeared into fireballs that rolled up the valley like the wrath of something Old Testament. Mara climbed back into the clouds, her heart rate steady at 70 beats per minute, and checked her weapons loadout. 9 Mavericks left, 1,600 rounds of 30mm, enough fuel for an hour, enough time to finish this. Dagger 6, valleys clear to your north, start moving your wounded. I'll hold the ridgelines until you're extracted. Revenant 1, extraction bird is 20 minutes out. Then I've got 20 minutes, let's make them count. For the next 18 minutes, Mara Blackwood flew a pattern that would later be analyzed at the weapons school and declared either brilliant or insane depending on who was teaching the class. She worked the valley like a surgeon with a scalpel made of depleted uranium, hitting targets that appeared and disappeared in the thermal imaging like ghosts playing peekaboo with death. Every gun run was a calculation made at 300 knots with mountains on either side, and bullets coming up to meet her like rain falling in reverse. The A-10 took hits, small arms fire that punched through the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit and left holes that whistled in the slipstream. She felt the aircraft shudder when a round hit something important in the left engine, felt the thrust drop in the airframe yaw right. She compensated with rudder and throttle, kept flying because stopping wasn't an option and dying wasn't on the schedule. Revenant 1, Dagger 6, we're loaded on the Hellos, you're cleared to break station. She looked down at the valley one last time, saw the Marines loading onto Chinooks that squatted on the valley floor like dragonflies made of aluminum and hope. Saw the enemy positions she'd turned into smoking ruins. Saw the mountains that had tried to kill her and failed. Dagger 6, Revenant 1 is departing the area. Get those boys home safe. Revenant 1, you just saved 23 lives. There aren't words. Dagger 6, the words are thank you and you're welcome. She turned south and climbed back into the weather, leaving the valley behind like a bad memory that would haunt better men than her. The damaged engine was running rough temperature gauges climbing into the red, and she could feel the airframe vibrating in ways that suggested structural damage she didn't want to think about. But the base was only 12 miles away, and she'd flown worse aircraft through worse conditions. She'd make it. She always made it. The clouds parted at 5,000 feet, and suddenly she was flying in clear air with the sun breaking through to paint everything gold. Below, the base appeared like a promise kept, runway lights already on even though sunset was still an hour away. She keyed the radio. Tower, Revenant 1 inbound with battle damage, requesting priority handling and emergency equipment standing by. Revenant 1 Tower, the beer's already cold and the whole base is watching. Bring it home. She did, gear down, flaps deployed, approach speed 30 knots faster than normal because she didn't trust the damaged hydraulics to keep her flying slow. The runway rose to meet her and the wheels kissed concrete with a squeal that sounded like relief expressed in rubber and friction. She deployed the drag chute and felt the deceleration press her forward against the harness, felt the aircraft slow from flying machine to broken bird in the span of 3,000 feet. When she finally taxied clear and shut down the engines, the silence was profound. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, watching fuel leak from a punctured tank and drip onto the tarmac like the aircraft was bleeding. Counted the bullet holes she could see from the seat. Stopped counting at 17. Sergeant Reyes was there when she climbed down. his face doing complicated things that suggested he'd spent the last 20 minutes convinced he was about to tell a 12-year-old girl that her mother wasn't coming home. He looked at the aircraft, looked at her, looked at the aircraft again. "Ma'am, you flew that." Apparently, her legs felt like water. "How bad is it?" "How bad, ma'am? This thing looks like it got in a fight with a scrapyard and lost. Left engines got turbine damage, hydraulic lines are shot to hell, and I count at least 20 penetrations in the fuselage. It's a miracle you made it back." She pulled off her helmet and looked at the A-10, really looked at it. The nose art was scorched. The tail section was riddled with holes. One of the vertical stabilizers had a chunk missing the size of her fist, but it had flown. Through weather and bullets and mountains that wanted to kill her, it had flown. "Not a miracle, Sergeant. Engineering. The people who built this thing knew what they were doing. The people who flew it did too." Behind them, a crowd was forming. Pilots and maintainers and people whose job titles Mara couldn't remember but whose faces all wore the same expression. Something between awe and horror. Major Vance pushed through them, still carrying the clipboard from the operations center, and stopped in front of her with his mouth open like he'd prepared a speech and forgotten every word. "Captain Blackwood," his voice was carefully neutral. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever witnessed. I haven't decided which. Sir, with respect, it doesn't matter which. Those Marines are alive." He looked at her for a long time, then at the aircraft, then back at her. Something shifted in his face. "Your call sign, Revenant, I thought it was because you came back, but that's not it, is it?" "No, sir. You're named after ghosts, the dead who come back to settle scores." She thought about her husband, about the fireball over Helmand, about the fact that she was flying his aircraft on missions he'd never get to fly. "Something like that, sir." "Well," Vance held out his hand. "Welcome back from the dead, Captain, again." She shook it, and behind them someone started clapping. Then someone else. Then the whole flight line erupted in applause that felt like absolution for sins she hadn't known she was carrying. 3 days later, the word came down from division. Captain Mara Blackwood was being put up for the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions above and beyond the call of duty in the face of overwhelming odds and impossible conditions. The citation would mention her skill, her courage, her devotion to the Marines on the ground. It would not mention that she was a single mother. Would not mention that she'd flown through weather that had grounded every other pilot on the base. Would not mention that 23 men were alive to hug their children because one woman had looked at impossible odds and decided they were negotiable. She was in the hangar when they told her, watching Sergeant Reyes and his crew strip the damaged engine from her A-10. The aircraft was grounded pending repairs that would take weeks, maybe months. New engine, new hydraulics, new everything that mattered. They'd offered her a different bird to fly in the meantime, but she'd declined. When the Widowmaker flew again, she wanted to be in the seat. Reyes looked up from a turbine blade that had a bullet embedded in the metal like a fossil. "Ma'am, you know what this means. You're going to be famous. They're going to write about you in the manuals. I'd rather they write about the maintainers who kept this bird flying, about the ground crews who loaded the weapons, about the Marines who held that valley long enough for help to arrive. Ma'am, with respect, those Marines held because they knew you were coming." She didn't have an answer for that. Walked outside into sunshine that felt too bright after days of clouds and weapons-grade adrenaline. Across the flight line, A-10s were taking off on training missions, their distinctive engine whine cutting through the afternoon heat. Somewhere in that valley 12 miles north, Taliban fighters were telling stories about the American pilot who'd come through the clouds like a demon made of gunfire and judgment. And somewhere back in the States, her daughter was in school, learning algebra and history and having no idea that her mother had just bought 23 families a future. That night, Mara sat in her quarters and wrote a letter she'd never send. Not to her daughter, not yet. But someday, when Kira was old enough to understand that heroism wasn't about fearlessness but about being terrified and flying anyway. When she was old enough to know that her mother had looked at a choice between safety and duty and picked duty every single time. The letter talked about the weight of a helmet, the sound of rounds hitting the fuselage, the way mountains looked when you were flying through them at 200 feet in weather that turned the world into nothing but faith and instruments. It talked about fear and courage and the complicated math of deciding your life was worth risking for strangers who'd never know your name. But mostly it talked about coming back, about the promise implicit in every takeoff that you'd see another landing, about the fact that being a revenant meant you were already dead in all the ways that mattered, which meant death couldn't touch you because it had already taken everything it could. She sealed the letter in an envelope and put it in a drawer with the others. 27 letters now, one for every mission she'd flown since Helmand. Since the day they'd handed her a folded flag and a daughter who didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. Since the day she decided that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford and death was an appointment she kept rescheduling. The knock on her door came late. Ray stood in the hallway holding a piece of metal about the size of his palm, scorched, twisted, barely recognizable as part of an aircraft. Found this in the wing root, piece of the engine cowling that should have taken your head off when the round hit. Instead it deflected into the fuselage. Quarter inch to the right and you'd have been flying home on instruments and prayer alone. She took it, felt the weight. What's your point, Sergeant? My point, ma'am, is that you're lucky, that you've been lucky for a long time, and luck runs out. Maybe, she turned the metal over in her hands, or maybe luck is just skill stretched thin enough to look like magic. He smiled at that, tired, resigned, the smile of a man who'd seen too many pilots push their luck until luck pushed back. Ma'am, you've got a daughter waiting for you. At some point, you're going to have to decide whether dying for strangers is worth making her an orphan. She won't be an orphan, she'll be the daughter of someone who stood up when it mattered. She'd rather have a mother. Mara looked at him for a long moment. Thought about Kira's face the last time she'd come home on leave. Thought about the way her daughter had hugged her like she was afraid Mara would disappear if she let go. Thought about bedtime stories and school plays and all the normal moments that slipped away while she was flying missions in places that didn't appear on maps. You're probably right, Sergeant, but that's not the choice I get to make. Why not? Because every time I don't fly, someone else has to. Someone else's daughter loses a father. Someone else's son doesn't come home. The math doesn't change just because I'm afraid. Reyes nodded slowly. You know what they're calling you now in the ready room. I'm afraid to ask. The Angel of the Valley. They're saying you came down through the clouds like divine intervention with a 30mm cannon. She laughed at that, actually laughed. Angels don't fly A-10s, wrong aesthetic, too much guns, not enough harp. Maybe, but those Marines think you're one, and ma'am, so do I. After he left, Mara stood at her window and looked out at the flight line where her aircraft sat dark and damaged, waiting for hands that would make it whole again. Waiting for another mission, another valley, another impossible situation that needed someone crazy enough to volunteer. She thought about angels and revenants and the thin line between courage and stupidity that only became clear in hindsight. She thought about her husband, about the fact that he'd died doing exactly what she was doing now. About the fact that Kira had already lost one parent to the war and would probably lose the other because Mara didn't know how to stop. Didn't know how to be the kind of person who stayed safe when people needed saving. The sky outside was clear now, stars visible for the first time in days. Somewhere up there her husband was watching or not watching or doing whatever the dead did with their time. She hoped he understood. Hoped he knew that flying his aircraft wasn't about grief but about finishing what he'd started. About proving that death didn't get the last word on who they'd been or what they'd stood for. The Distinguished Flying Cross came in a ceremony 3 weeks later. Some general whose name she forgot immediately pinned the medal on her chest and said words about valor and sacrifice that sounded like they'd been written by committee and approved by lawyers. The assembled crowd clapped politely. Cameras flashed. Somewhere a public affairs officer was already drafting the press release that would turn her into a recruitment poster. She stood at attention and thought about the valley. About the Marines who'd gone home to their families because she'd been willing to fly when everyone else had stayed grounded. About the Taliban fighters who'd learned that clouds weren't cover against an A-10 flown by someone who didn't believe in limitations. About her daughter back home, watching this on video, learning that her mother was both a hero and a stranger who lived on the other side of the world and came home smelling like jet fuel and carrying nightmares. After the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photographs and the required socializing with officers who wanted to touch someone who'd looked death in the eye and won, Mara escaped to the flight line. Her A-10 was back from maintenance. New engine installed, hydraulic lines replaced, bullet holes patched with fresh aluminum that gleamed like scars in the fatting light. The nose art had been repainted. Widowmaker in letters that looked less like a child's handwriting and more like a promise. Sergeant Reyes found her there, standing beside the aircraft with her hand on the fuselage like she was checking the pulse of something still alive. She's ready to fly, ma'am. Better than new. Nothing's better than new, but maybe better than before. When are you taking her up? Tomorrow, training mission. Low-altitude tactical navigation through the same valley where we pulled out those Marines. Command wants to see if anyone else can replicate what I did. Can they? She looked at him and smiled. Small, sad, the smile of someone who knew a secret the rest of the world would learn eventually. No, but they'll try, and trying is how you learn not to be afraid of the impossible. The next morning she flew, strapped herself into the cockpit that smelled like hydraulic fluid and old fear, ran through the checklist that had become a prayer she recited to gods of thrust and lift, took off into a clear sky that mocked her with its benevolence and turned north toward mountains that looked different in sunshine, looked smaller, less threatening. like the bones of something that had died a long time ago and no longer had the strength to haunt anyone. She flew the valley low, 200 feet above the deck, tracing the same path she'd flown through clouds and bullets. The targeting pod showed empty slopes where Taliban positions had been, scorched earth where her Mavericks had found their marks. The bones of trucks still scattered across the valley floor like broken toys. Evidence of violence translated into topography. This was what winning looked like from altitude. This was what survival cost when you measured it in missiles and ammunition and aircraft that came home full of holes. She pulled up and climbed into clear air, and the radio crackled with the training flight behind her. Young pilots trying to follow her line, trying to fly as low and as fast and as precise. She listened to them struggle with the terrain, heard the stress in their voices as mountains rose up on either side and the margin for error shrank to nothing. Revenant 1, this is Phantom 3. I can't hold this altitude in the turbulence. Requesting permission to climb. Phantom 3, Revenant 1, permission granted. This valley doesn't forgive mistakes. She listened to them climb one by one, choosing safety over the mission profile, choosing to live rather than prove something to themselves. Smart, sensible, exactly what she'd never learned to do. When she landed an hour later, the debrief was quiet. The young pilots looked at her like she was something carved from different material than they were, something harder, less breakable. She wanted to tell them the truth, that she was just as breakable as anyone else, just better at hiding the cracks, that every mission left scars they couldn't see, that someday the cracks would spread and she'd come apart like the trucks in that valley, scattered across the landscape in pieces too small to identify. But she didn't say any of that, said instead that practice would make them better. That fear was useful until it became paralyzing, that the A-10 was a forgiving aircraft if you treated it with respect and a brutal teacher if you didn't. After they filed out, Major Vance stayed behind. He'd been promoted since the valley. Lieutenant Colonel now, more responsibility, more authority, more reasons to regret sending her on missions that should have killed her. Captain, I'm putting you up for instructor duty. Weapons school. They want someone who can teach these kids how to fly low and survive. She shook her head. Sir, with respect, I'm not a teacher, I'm operational. You're a weapon that's too valuable to waste on routine missions. Those Marines you saved, their story got picked up by every news outlet in the country. You're famous whether you want to be or not. And famous pilots don't fly combat missions. They fly recruiting tour and inspire the next generation. So this is a punishment for doing my job. This is me trying to keep you alive long enough to retire. Your daughter deserves to see you grow old. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, A-10s were taxiing for another training mission, their ugly grace a reminder that sometimes the best tools were the ones that looked like mistakes until you saw them work. Sir, my daughter deserves a lot of things, but most of all she deserves a mother who stands up when it matters, who doesn't hide behind a desk when people need saving. She deserves a mother, period. Then she should have been born to someone else. The words hung in the air like confession, like something she'd been carrying and finally put down. Vance looked at her for a long time, his face doing complicated arithmetic with guilt and responsibility, and the knowledge that arguing with someone already dead inside was a waste of breath. Orders will come through next week. Weapons school in Nevada, you'll hate it there, but you'll be alive to hate it. After he left, Mara sat alone in the briefing room and thought about Nevada, about deserts that didn't hide Taliban fighters, about training missions flown in clear weather over terrain that didn't want to kill you, about the careful management of risk until risk became theoretical instead of immediate, about teaching young pilots to fly like her while secretly hoping they'd be smarter, safer, more afraid of dying than of living with cowardice. She thought about calling her daughter, about trying to explain that she was being moved stateside, that they'd see each other more often, that maybe they could have something like a normal life. But normal felt like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. And Kira deserved better than a mother who'd come home physically but never really left the war. That night she wrote another letter, talked about the difference between courage and recklessness, about the fact that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was walk away from the fight, about how she'd never learned that lesson and probably never would, about how Kira should be better, should be smarter, should know when enough was enough and it was time to save yourself instead of everyone else. She sealed the letter and added it to the drawer with the others. 28 now, an archive of survival that looked increasingly like borrowed time. She wondered how many more she'd write before someone had to deliver them all at once, a complete record of a woman who'd been half-ghost since Helmand and was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The transfer orders came through on a Wednesday. Weapons School, Nellie's Air Force Base, reporting date in 2 weeks. Instructor pilot specializing in close air support and low-altitude operations. They'd even assigned her housing. A small place off base where she could have a normal life with her daughter, where Kira could attend a real school instead of bouncing between her grandmother's house and whatever friends' couches they could find. Mara read the orders 3 times looking for the trap, the catch. The fine print that would explain why this felt less like a promotion and more like being put out to pasture, but the words stayed the same. She was going home, going to teach instead of fight, going to be safe in all the ways that mattered to everyone except her. Sergeant Reyes found her packing her quarters, stuffing 12 months of deployment into a duffel bag that had seen more countries than most tourists. He watched her fold uniforms with the precision of someone who'd learned that order was the only control you had over chaos. So it's true they're sending you stateside. Apparently teaching is the new combat. Ma'am, if I may speak freely. You're going to anyway, Sergeant. He smiled at that. This is good news. You get to see your daughter, get to sleep in a bed that doesn't smell like deployed, get to fly training missions where the worst thing that happens is some lieutenant bends his landing gear because he came in too hot. Sounds boring. Sounds alive, he paused. Your daughter's name is Kira, right? Yeah. How old? 12, almost 13. That's a hard age between being a kid and being something else. She needs her mom. Mara stopped packing, looked at a photograph she'd taped to the wall. Kira at her 6th birthday party, face covered in chocolate cake, smile wide enough to break hearts. Back when Daddy was still alive and deployments were temporary and the world made sense in ways it never would again. She needs a mom who's present, who's whole. I don't know if I qualify anymore. Ma'am, you flew through mountains in weather that should have killed you to save 23 strangers. You think you don't have it in you to show up for your own daughter. That's different. Combat has rules. Parenthood is chaos with homework. Combat is chaos with bullets, and you've been doing that for years. Time to try the other kind. After he left, she finished packing, called her daughter on a connection that lagged and stuttered and turned their conversation into stop-motion vulnerability, told Kira about Nevada, about how they'd live together in a real house with a real yard, about how Mara would be home every night instead of every few months, about how things were going to be normal now. Kira was quiet on the other end. Then, Mom, are you dying? The question hit like turbulence. What? No, why would you ask that? Because you sound like you're saying goodbye, like when Dad called that last time before, her voice cracked, before he didn't come home. Mara closed her eyes, felt the weight of her daughter's fear like G-forces pressing her into place. Baby, I'm not dying, I'm coming home. That's the opposite of dying. You've been saying you'll come home for 6 years, you're always somewhere else, fighting someone else's war. This time is different. How? How indeed? How do you explain to a child that you're being forced into safety like it's punishment? That the war had become easier than peace because at least in combat you knew who the enemy was. Because this time they're making me, and because I miss you so much it hurts. Long silence, then Kira's voice, small and young and carrying 6 years of absence in every syllable. Do you even remember what I look like? The question destroyed her. Every day, every mission, every time I close my eyes. Then come home, please, just come home. 2 weeks later, Mara Blackwood left Afghanistan on a C-17 loaded with equipment and personnel rotating out of theater. She sat in the cargo webbing and watched the country fall away through the open ramp, mountains giving way to desert, giving way to nothing. Beside her, young soldiers slept or played cards or stared at nothing the way people do when they're trying to forget what they've seen. She felt old among them. Ancient. A revenant from wars they were too young to remember and too smart to romanticize. The flight took forever and no time at all. When they landed in Germany for refueling, she bought chocolate at the base exchange and wondered if Kira still liked dark chocolate or if tastes changed when you only saw your mother through a screen. When they landed in the States, she cleared customs like a stranger returning to a country that felt foreign in its familiarity. The last time she'd been here was for her husband's funeral, before Helmand became holy ground, before she decided that survival was overrated and devotion to the dead was more honest than living for yourself. She rented a car and drove to Nevada through landscape that looked like the surface of Mars, if Mars had strip malls and billboards advertising injury lawyers. Arrived at Nellie's as the sun was setting, the base sprawling and permanent in ways forward operating bases never were. Checked into her new quarters, a duplex with actual walls and a yard where nothing grew except rocks and faith. And then she drove to her daughter. Kira lived with her grandmother in a house on the northern edge of Las Vegas, where the suburbs gave way to desert and the night sky still remembered stars. Mara sat in the rental car for 10 minutes working up courage that had never failed in combat but felt insufficient for knocking on a door. Finally she got out, walked to the porch, and rang the bell like she was intruding on someone else's life. The door opened and there was her daughter, taller, older, hair darker than she remembered, eyes the same gray-green that had been her father's, looking at Mara like she was trying to match the person in front of her with the memory she'd been carrying.
Moms, hey babies.
They stood there in the doorway while time did complicated things with absence and longing, and the specific gravity of 6 years compressed into a moment. Then Kira stepped forward and hugged her mother with the desperate strength of someone who'd learned that people you loved could disappear into deserts and never come back. Mara held her and felt the cracks inside her spread, felt the armor she'd built crack under the weight of her daughter's need, felt herself become something more than a pilot, more than a weapon, more than a ghost who'd forgotten how to be human. "I'm home," she whispered into Kira's hair. "I'm finally home." And for the first time in 6 years, she meant it.